My name is Claire, and I'm 24 years old. 3 years ago, I thought I knew what family meant. I believed blood was thicker than water, that your family would always have your back no matter what. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It started with a stupid key. Something so small, so meaningless, that it seems crazy how it changed everything. My brother left our house key under the doormat again, right in front of a complete stranger who was walking by. I'd told him 100 times not to do this. Our neighborhood wasn't the safest, and leaving keys where anyone could see them was just asking for trouble. But my brother never listened to me about anything. When I confronted him about it that evening, something in his eyes shifted. The usual annoyance turned darker, meaner. "Mind your own business," he snarled, but I couldn't let it go this time. "It is my business when you're putting our whole family at risk," I shot back. That's when he snapped. The insults started flying fast and harsh. Words meant to cut deep, to hurt. Then came the hands. He grabbed my throat with both hands and lifted me clean off the floor. My feet dangled in the air as his fingers squeezed tighter and tighter around my neck. I couldn't breathe. The world started spinning, going dark around the edges as I clawed desperately at his hands. When I finally collapsed to the floor, gasping and choking, I thought it was over. I was wrong. He punched me again, hard, right in the face. The pain exploded through my skull, and I tasted blood in my mouth. That's when instinct kicked in. I grabbed the pepper spray from my purse and sprayed him full in the face. He screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his eyes. With shaking hands, I called my father. Dad was my last hope, my final safety net. Surely he would protect me. Surely he would see what his son had done and make it right. When Dad arrived 20 minutes later, I was still sitting on the floor, my throat aching, my face swelling. I looked up at him with desperate, pleading eyes. But Dad didn't even glance at my bruises. Instead, he looked at me with that familiar expression of disappointment and asked the question that broke my heart: "What did you do to provoke him?" Those words hit me harder than my brother's fists. What did I do to provoke him? As if asking someone not to leave keys where strangers could find them was grounds for attempted murder. As if I was somehow responsible for being strangled in my own home. Dad helped my brother wash the pepper spray from his eyes, murmuring gentle words of comfort. For me, there was nothing. No concern, no anger on my behalf, no protection. Just that cold question that made it clear whose side he was on. Dinner that night was the most horrible meal of my life. We sat around the table in complete silence. I was seated right beside the boy who had almost killed me just hours earlier, and across from the man who saw me as the problem. Every swallow hurt because of the damage to my throat. Every breath was a reminder of how close I'd come to dying. And through it all, my family acted like nothing had happened. Like it was just another Tuesday night. That's when I knew I had to leave. That night, I quietly packed a suitcase. I didn't take much, just enough clothes for a few days and my most important belongings. I moved like a ghost through the house, careful not to wake anyone. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I was terrified my brother would hear me and finish what he'd started earlier. As I folded my clothes with trembling hands, I kept replaying Dad's question in my mind. What did I do to provoke him? The answer was simple: I had dared to speak up. I had dared to question my brother's reckless behavior. In my family, that was apparently a crime punishable by strangulation. I zipped up the suitcase and took one last look around my childhood room. The walls were covered with memories, photos, awards, artwork from school. But none of it felt like mine anymore. This house had never been safe, I realized. I had just been too young, too naive to see it before. Now I knew better. I left before dawn, slipping out through the back door while everyone was still asleep. The morning air was cold against my bruised face, but it felt like freedom. I had nowhere to go except Belinda's apartment. Belinda had been my best friend since middle school, the only person who really understood what my family was like. She'd seen the way my brother treated me, the way Dad always took his side. When she opened her door at 6 in the morning and saw my face, she didn't ask any questions. She just stepped aside to let me in, handed me a soft blanket, and pointed to the couch. "You can stay as long as you need," she said simply. That's when I finally cried. All the pain and fear and disappointment came pouring out in ugly, wrenching sobs. Belinda sat beside me and rubbed my back, not saying anything, just being there. For the first time in hours, I felt safe enough to fall apart. And fall apart I did, completely and utterly. In the morning light, I saw the bruises clearly for the first time. Belinda gasped when she looked at my neck. Dark purple fingerprints circled my throat like a terrible necklace. My face was swollen and discolored where he'd punched me. I looked like I'd been in a car accident. "He could have killed you," Belinda whispered, her voice shaking with horror. I didn't answer. I just stared at my reflection in her bathroom mirror, trying to process what I was seeing. This was what my brother had done to me. This was what my father had dismissed as something I'd provoked. The evidence was right there on my skin, impossible to deny or minimize. Yet somehow, I knew that if I went back home, they would find a way to make it my fault. They would say I was being dramatic, that I was exaggerating, that brothers and sisters fight sometimes. They would never see these bruises as proof of attempted murder. They would see them as proof that I was a troublemaker who couldn't get along with family. Later that day, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. I expected an apology, or at least some acknowledgement of what he'd done. Instead, I got 4 words that told me everything I needed to know about his character. "You overreacted." No apology. No remorse. No recognition that he'd nearly killed me. Just blame. Just the suggestion that my reaction to being strangled was somehow inappropriate. I showed the message to Belinda, and she shook her head in disgust. "He's not even sorry," she said. "He actually thinks you're the problem here." That message was like a light bulb going off in my head. It showed me exactly who my brother really was, stripped of all the excuses and justifications I'd made for him over the years. He was someone who could strangle his own sister and then blame her for it. He was someone who felt no guilt, no shame, no empathy. He was dangerous, and he always would be. There was no fixing this. There was no going back. The next day, Dad called once. Just once. When I saw his name on my phone, my heart jumped with hope. Maybe he'd had time to think about what happened. Maybe he'd realized how wrong he'd been. Maybe he was calling to check on me, to apologize, to make things right. I answered on the second ring, my voice shaky with anticipation. But Dad didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't mention my injuries or express any concern for my well-being. Instead, his first words were, "Come home and stop the drama." Stop the drama. As if nearly being murdered was just me being dramatic. As if leaving was an act of rebellion rather than an act of survival. I hung up without saying a word. When he called back immediately, I didn't answer. When he called again an hour later, I still didn't answer. After the 3rd missed call, I blocked his number. If he wanted to treat attempted murder as drama, then he could deal with the real drama of never hearing from me again. A week later, I walked into a job interview with a cracked voice and hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The bruises on my face had faded to yellow and green, but they were still visible under my makeup. I was terrified that the interviewer would ask about them, that I'd have to explain why I looked like I'd been beaten up. But somehow, miraculously, I got the job. It was just a part-time position at a small office, nothing glamorous, but it was mine. It was a start. As I walked out of that building with a job offer in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Maybe starting over really was possible. Maybe I could build a life away from the violence and chaos of my family. Maybe there was a future where I didn't have to be afraid every single day. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time since that terrible night, I believed it might be possible. I had taken the first step toward freedom. With my new job, I was able to rent a small room in a house across town. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a bed, and a tiny closet. The furniture was all secondhand, and the paint was peeling in several places. It smelled old and musty, like it had been empty for a long time. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had a space that belonged entirely to me. A space where I could lock the door and know that I was safe. A space where no one could hurt me. I spent my first night there lying awake on the creaky mattress, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my new neighborhood. Every car that drove by, every footstep in the hallway, every creak of the old house made me nervous. But underneath the nervousness was something else, relief. Sweet, overwhelming relief. I had done it. I had escaped. I was free. The room might have smelled old, but to me, it smelled like safety. Like possibility. Like the beginning of a new life. Sunday morning came, and for the first time in years, I woke up without fear. There was no yelling from downstairs, no slamming doors, no tension crackling through the air like electricity. Just quiet. Beautiful, peaceful quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the small window in my room, watching the world wake up outside. People walked their dogs, joggers ran past, families headed to church. Normal people living normal lives, free from violence and fear. I realized I could be one of them now. I could be someone who didn't flinch at sudden movements or loud voices. Someone who didn't have to calculate the safest place to sit at dinner. Someone who could just exist without constantly watching for signs of danger. It felt unnatural after so many years of hypervigilance, but it also felt right. This was how life was supposed to be. This was what peace felt like. I had forgotten, but now I was remembering. In a moment of weakness, I wrote a letter to my father. I poured everything into it, all my pain, all my anger, all my desperate need for him to understand what he had done wrong. I wrote about the years of watching him favor my brother, about the way he dismissed my concerns, about how abandoned I'd felt when he asked what I'd done to provoke being strangled. I wrote about how much I'd needed him to protect me, and how devastating it was when he chose his son's comfort over his daughter's safety. Page after page, I poured my heart out, hoping that maybe, somehow, words could make him see. But when I finished writing, I realized the truth. He wouldn't understand anyway. He had made his choice years ago, and nothing I could say would change that. So I folded the letter carefully, tore it into tiny pieces, and threw it in the trash. Some conversations are impossible to have. Some people are impossible to reach. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying. One evening, about a month after I'd left, my brother showed up at my door. I saw him through the peephole, pacing back and forth on the front porch, clearly working up his nerve. When he knocked, I didn't answer. When he knocked again, louder this time, I stayed silent. Finally, he called out, "I know you're in there. I just want to talk." But I had learned not to trust his words. The last time he'd wanted to talk, he'd ended up with his hands around my throat. So I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged, and looked him in the eye. "You scared me," I said simply. "I'm not pretending you didn't." His face twisted with frustration and anger. He started to argue, to make excuses, to explain why what he'd done wasn't really that bad. But I closed the door in the middle of his sentence. I wasn't interested in his justifications. I had lived through the reality of his violence, and no amount of talking was going to change that. A few weeks later, my aunt messaged me on social media. The family wanted to have a meeting to clear the air, she said. Everyone was worried about me, and they thought if we all just sat down together and talked things through, we could put this whole misunderstanding behind us. I stared at that message for a long time. A misunderstanding. That's what they were calling it. Not attempted murder. Not domestic violence. Not a family crisis that required serious intervention. Just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a nice family chat. I left her message on read. I wasn't interested in clearing the air with people who thought strangulation was a misunderstanding. I wasn't interested in sitting around a table with my would-be killer while everyone pretended that we were just having a normal family disagreement. Some things can't be talked through. Some wounds can't be healed with conversation. Some relationships are too broken to fix, and this was one of them. A few months later, Belinda brought me a box that had been left at my old house. Inside was one of my mother's old journals, something my family had found while cleaning out the attic. Mom had died when I was 15, and I'd never seen this particular notebook before. As I flipped through the pages, reading her handwritten thoughts and observations, I discovered something that broke my heart all over again. She had lived the same silence I had. Page after page documented my brother's violent outbursts, Dad's refusal to address them, and Mom's growing fear for my safety. She had seen it all, understood it all, and felt powerless to stop it. "I'm worried about what will happen to her when I'm gone," she'd written just months before her death. "He gets worse every year, and her father won't see it." Reading those words, I realized that Mom had known exactly what kind of man my brother was becoming. She had tried to protect me in small ways, but the cancer had taken her before she could do more. Now I understood why I'd always felt like she was trying to tell me something in those final months. She had been trying to warn me. For the first time in 5 years, I visited Mom's grave. I stood there in the quiet cemetery, surrounded by flowers and weathered headstones, and whispered the words I'd been carrying in my heart. "I left, Mom. I finally left." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I felt like she was there with me, proud of me for finding the strength she'd never had. I told her about my little room, about my job, about the peace I'd found in my new life. I told her about Dad's reaction, about my brother's lack of remorse, about the family meeting I'd refused to attend. And I promised her that I would never go back to that house of violence and denial. I would never again live in fear of the son she'd loved but couldn't control. As I walked away from her grave, I felt lighter somehow. Like I'd finally fulfilled a promise I'd made to her long ago, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. I had saved myself. I had broken the cycle. I had chosen life. My father kept trying to reach me. Calls, texts, messages through relatives. "Come home for Christmas," one text read. "Come home for Easter. Come home for your cousin's wedding." Each message was an invitation back into the world that had nearly killed me. I deleted them all without responding. Home isn't a place that hurts you, I reminded myself. Home is supposed to be safe, loving, protective. The place I'd grown up was none of those things. It was a house full of violence and denial, where the victim was always blamed and the aggressor was always protected. That wasn't home. That was a prison I'd finally escaped from. The people who truly loved me understood why I couldn't go back. Belinda never once suggested I should reconcile with my family. She had seen my bruises, heard my stories, witnessed my fear. She knew that some relationships are too toxic to salvage. The people who kept pushing for reconciliation were the ones who cared more about family appearances than family safety. Their opinions didn't matter to me anymore. A year later, I signed the lease on my own apartment. Not just a room in someone else's house, but a real apartment with my own kitchen, my own bathroom, my own living room. No roommates, no shared spaces, no noise from other people's lives bleeding through the walls. It was small but perfect, and I bought everything secondhand: a couch from a garage sale, a kitchen table from a thrift store, dishes from a charity shop. Every piece had been chosen by me, arranged by me, paid for by me. It wasn't fancy, but it was entirely mine. On my first night there, I cooked dinner for myself and ate it at my own table, in my own space, surrounded by my own things. The silence was complete and beautiful. No one could disturb it. No one could take it away from me. I had built something real and solid and safe, something that belonged to no one but me. It was the first time in my life that I felt truly at home. This was what freedom looked like. This was what peace felt like. I set my own schedule now. I cleaned when I felt like it, not when someone demanded it. I ate dinner at midnight if I wanted to, or had breakfast for dinner, or skipped meals entirely without anyone commenting on it. I could leave dishes in the sink overnight without being screamed at. I could play music without being told it was too loud. I could come and go as I pleased without explaining myself to anyone. No one yelled at me. No one slammed doors or punched walls or grabbed my throat. I didn't need permission to be myself, to make my own choices, to live my own life. It sounds simple, but after years of walking on eggshells, these small freedoms felt revolutionary. I was learning who I really was when I wasn't constantly afraid. I was discovering my own preferences, my own rhythms, my own way of being in the world. And I liked the person I was becoming. She was stronger than I'd thought possible, braver than I'd ever imagined, and finally free. The physical bruises faded within a few weeks, but the emotional ones took much longer to heal. Sometimes I still flinched at loud voices or sudden movements. Sometimes I still felt that old panic rising in my chest when I heard arguing through the walls of my apartment building. The hypervigilance that had kept me alive for so many years didn't just disappear overnight. But healing isn't a straight line, I reminded myself. It's a winding path with setbacks and breakthroughs, good days and bad days. The important thing was that I was walking it. I was doing the work of recovering from a lifetime of trauma. Some days were harder than others, but every day I was a little bit further from the person I'd been in that house of fear. Every day I was a little bit more myself. The scars would always be there, but they didn't define me anymore. They were just proof that I had survived something terrible and come out the other side. They were proof of my strength, not my weakness. 6 months later, something interesting happened at work. HR called me into their office and told me that someone had tried to use my name as a reference on a job application. It was my father, apparently trying to get a new position and listing me as a character reference. They wanted to know if I would be willing to speak with them about his qualifications. I told them the truth, quietly and firmly. I explained that I had no contact with this person, that he was not someone I would recommend, and that he had used my name without permission. I didn't go into details about why I'd cut contact, but I made it clear that his use of my name was unauthorized and unwelcome. The HR representative nodded understandingly and assured me that they would not be contacting me again about this matter. As I walked back to my desk, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Dad had assumed he could still use me, still benefit from my reputation and accomplishments, even after everything he'd done. But I wasn't his to use anymore. I belonged to myself now. People often tell me that I need to forgive my family to truly move on. They say that holding on to anger will only hurt me in the end, that forgiveness is for my own peace of mind, not theirs. But I don't agree with that philosophy. I've moved on just fine without forgiveness. I've built a good life, found peace, created my own version of happiness. I don't carry anger with me every day. I don't obsess over what they did to me. I simply don't have them in my life anymore, and that's exactly how I want it. Forgiveness isn't a requirement for healing. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is acknowledge that some people will never change, some relationships will never be safe, and some wounds are too deep to simply forgive and forget. Sometimes, moving on means accepting that some people don't deserve a place in your life, regardless of how they're related to you. I've made peace with the past by leaving it in the past. That's enough for me. One night, I heard shouting through the wall of my apartment. My neighbors were having some kind of argument, and the man's voice was getting louder and more aggressive by the minute. The sound transported me right back to that terrible night, and I found myself sitting in the dark, shaking, my hand unconsciously moving to my throat. The old fear came flooding back in waves. But this time, something was different. This time, I was safe. The shouting wasn't directed at me. The danger wasn't in my home. I was just a witness to someone else's pain, not a victim of it. After the noise died down, I texted Belinda, "Thank you for opening the door that night." She texted back immediately, "Always. I'm proud of how far you've come." And I realized she was right. I had come far. The scared, bruised girl who'd shown up on her doorstep was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had built her own life, who would never again accept violence as normal. The shouting next door still bothered me, but it didn't control me. I was stronger now. My birthday came and went without a single call from my family. In the past, this would have devastated me. I would have spent the day crying, wondering why they didn't care enough to reach out, feeling abandoned and forgotten. But this year was different. Instead of waiting for their calls, I took control of my own celebration. I baked myself a cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, my favorite since childhood. I called Belinda, and we spent the evening watching movies and laughing until our sides hurt. It was simple, quiet, and perfect. I didn't need a big party or expensive gifts or dramatic declarations of love. I just needed people who actually cared about my well-being, people who celebrated me for who I really was, not who they wanted me to be. It was the best birthday I'd had in years, precisely because it was free from the tension and drama that had always accompanied family gatherings. Sometimes, less really is more. Sometimes, the best celebrations are the ones where you feel completely safe to be yourself. A coworker quietly confessed to me one day that she was struggling at home. She didn't give me all the details, but I could see the familiar signs, the flinching at loud noises, the carefully applied makeup that didn't quite hide the dark circles, the way she made excuses for someone else's behavior. I listened to her without trying to fix her situation or push her toward any particular choice. I just let her know that she wasn't alone, that someone saw her pain and believed her story. I didn't tell her what to do, because I knew that decision had to be hers. But I made sure she knew that she had options, that there were people who would help her if she decided to help herself. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is just be the person you once needed. Sometimes, strength isn't about having all the answers, it's about sitting with someone in their darkness and reminding them that they're not alone. I couldn't save her the way I'd saved myself, but I could offer her what Belinda had offered me, a door, should she choose to walk through it. I used to dream of my father apologizing. I would imagine him showing up at my door with tears in his eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd allowed to happen. I pictured him begging for forgiveness, promising to make things right, choosing me over my brother for once in his life. But I don't have those dreams anymore. I've accepted that some apologies will never come, some acknowledgments will never be made, some relationships will never be repaired. And surprisingly, I'm okay with that. I don't need his validation to know that what happened to me was wrong. I don't need his remorse to heal from the trauma he helped create. I don't need his love to feel worthy of love. The peace I've found doesn't depend on him changing or growing or seeing the error of his ways. It depends only on me continuing to choose myself, to protect myself, to build the life I deserve. Some things will never be said, and that's actually fine. Silence can be its own kind of answer. Today, I still hear echoes of the past sometimes. A door slamming in the hallway can make my heart race. Raised voices can trigger that old hypervigilance. But these echoes don't control me anymore. They're just reminders of where I've been, not indicators of where I'm going. My freedom isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, calm, and real. It's the sound of my own breathing in a safe space. It's the feeling of falling asleep without fear. It's the knowledge that no one can hurt me in my own home because I choose who has access to it. It's the peace that comes from living authentically, without pretending that toxic relationships are normal or acceptable. My freedom is in the ordinary moments, making coffee in my own kitchen, reading a book in my own living room, going to sleep in my own bed. These simple acts are revolutionary when you've spent years living in fear. They're proof that I've built something real and lasting and good. I never went back to that house. I never needed to. Over the years, various family members have reached out with invitations and guilt trips and promises that things have changed. But I know better now. I know that people don't change unless they want to, and my family has never shown any real desire to change. They've never acknowledged the severity of what happened. They've never taken responsibility for the culture of violence and denial they created. They've never done the work necessary to become safe people. So when they beg, when they plead, when they try to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. I remember that night. I remember my brother's hands around my throat. I remember my father's question about what I'd done to provoke it. I remember the sound of my own choking. And I remember that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is choose to never walk through the same door again. Even when they beg. Even when they cry. Even when they promise it will be different this time. Sometimes, closing the door is the most loving thing you can do, for them, and especially for yourself.